What is up, everyone? So I do not have James today. He skipped out on me. Shame on him. But I kind of had something top of mind, and it's been a long topic in poker, and I just thought I would jump on and talk about it a little bit. So the topic is really just like, who do you trust for poker knowledge? Who do you trust, who recommends XYZ strategies? What is the right level of credibility? And I think it's a fascinating topic personally, something that has always been prominent in my study of the game. And also, I think it's something that people struggle with greatly, right? They end up trusting a source of information that's maybe not credible, or they trust a credible person in an area where maybe they aren't credible as well. And they kind of just conflate their credibility in one aspect with another. So yeah, I mean, I just honestly think it's fascinating. And I'll kind of give you the spoiler up front. And this is something that I've gleaned from, being a professional back in 2004, 2005, when the game was super unsolved, but also from the business world, where I spent, nearly a decade consulting and running a business. So basically my kind of opinion on people's level of credibility and trust is that I don't really trust anyone to fully make decisions for me. Whenever I'm learning something, if it's a level of importance that I'm going to be risking significant sources of significant finances on, or making big decisions on personally, like, there's no one I trust. I trust myself. And what that means is that either A, I'm going to have a limited set of information, depending on the amount of time that I can dedicate to said activity, right? So if we're talking about, like, say, the stock market, I've done some stuff with the markets in the past, but it's really never been something I've dedicated much time to. Should I then go ahead and rely on someone who trades professionally to manage my money? Well, maybe yes, maybe no. What are the costs of doing that? What are the biases that they will have in managing my money versus, say, their own? Maybe they have a different level of, like, risk tolerance and financial management strategy. And so when I look at that type of equation, I just say, well, I'm just going to trust myself. Like, I trust myself to assess the situation and figure out what I want to do and the things that'll meet my needs. And I realize I will be at an information deficit compared to the people who do it full-time professionally. And if I have time, I will actually try and go and dig through their logic, but it's always me interpreting their logic and what's useful to me, what isn't, what seems to apply, what doesn't, and contextualizing that information. And so let's bring that back to poker. I think one of the things that people love to do is they love to watch high stakes games, right? And so how applicable is a high stakes poker game to, learning how to beat 1-2, 2-5, maybe even going up to 5-10, 10-20? It's really hard to say. It's really hard to say how well a high stakes game applies. If you're just going to watch the game and then apply the plays directly, like, that may not work at all, right? Because the preflop ranges are different. The bluffing ranges and capabilities are different. The stack sizes are different. Like, the level of applicability, comparing, the super high stakes games, we're watching high stakes poker right now, 400, 800 with $200,000 deep minimum. It just doesn't apply to a 1-2 game where people might buy in for $100. Just doesn't. Like, it's just not that useful. That said, can you learn something from watching that? And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes. You absolutely can. In fact, this is something that I've done throughout my career. Is in 2006, 2007, we'd get these videos released on Card Runners, where CTS or one of the high stakes players would release videos, and there would just be plays and things like that we had never seen before. We'd never seen a lot of public 4-bet bluffing, and even the wide ranges of 3-bet bluffing and things like that. This also happened with the light call downs, I'd say around the 2009 era. Jungle Man was kind of the one I can think who was most prominent about sort of expanding the call ranges. And yeah, people just never had seen that type of play. And then all of a sudden that sort of entered the meta, or sort of the public discourse, let's say, when we got to see a public example of this. And was that information useful? Like, absolutely it was. So that was something that was happening in the high stakes online games that, started being used at 1-2, 1-2 heads up, 1-2 cash, whatever it was. So yeah, it's just, but you can kind of see there isn't like a direct application. It's like, oh, CTS made this play with ace-5 offsuit, therefore I can have ace-5 offsuit in my range. You actually have to really dig into the logic of why he was doing it and why it was applicable. And, say in the case of 4-bet bluffing, because people back in the day weren't 3-bet bluffing that much at small stakes, the level of applicability of like a lot of 4-bet bluffing, it wasn't direct. But you could actually take the idea and the logic to find good 4-bet bluffs, but you couldn't do it the same way that they were doing it at high stakes. It had to be different. So, yeah, that's the nuance, right? And then I think, what are the other sources of, credible information people use, right? Software is kind of like the default one. We have simulations in GTO. But we all kind of, if you don't know the limitations of some of that, they don't handle multi-way pots well. You're always reliant on the pre-flop range assumptions, right? So if you're doing a GTO range, you basically have to say, okay, either I'm going to give my opponent this exact range, which is just you choosing their range, which may or may not be correct, or you have to give them a GTO range, which almost no one follows when you play a real poker game, right? So what is the level of applicability of the information that you're going to get off the back of that? Well, I don't know. And how do you figure that out? So, and this kind of brings up the question of like, how much time do you have to dedicate to the activity? And I think that's the most important thing. So for me, I was always oriented towards being a professional poker player. I wasn't going to make any compromises on the information. And for me, that meant I never trusted what anyone said. Like, it was interesting seeing what Duan was doing or hearing what he was doing over Skype or something like that. And the same with all the players I got access to back in the day. But like, I didn't apply it directly. I was interested in it. It might push my study in that direction, but I would always make the final decision on my plays and how I thought about the game and what I thought was correct. And I would honestly recommend that to anyone else as well, right? Like, you have to commit the time to be at the absolute highest levels to get the absolute best information. You should always be the arbiter of truth. And that means you will be wrong, by the way, especially as you learn something or you learn a new game. Like, it can be useful to get direction and information and all that type of thing from people. But at the end of the day, you want to be the final screen for information. So yeah, that's the no compromises, like I have the most possible time answer. So what do you do if you don't have a lot of time? That's a big challenge, right? And I think this is really where the poker sites kind of come in. And, people kind of go into a lot of people I will find will go into learning about a poker strategy or whatever with the mentality of just like, I just want to copy exactly what someone's doing. And, or I just want to like, in the business world, we would call it like completely outsourcing it to someone else. So it's like, I remember I would have clients like approach me and be like, oh, I just want you to build this website. And like, I don't want to have to think about it. What is it going to cost? And so, a really good comparison is, so, we would, as an agency or a team or whatever, would quote someone, okay, like the level of complexity on the website might cost you $20,000, more complicated website, advanced checkout, $100,000, et cetera. But our actual cost on building that website, oftentimes, or if I were to say build that website on my own, it might only cost me $5,000, $500 for a small website, something like that. Sometimes, just totally free, right? Or like just the minimal cost of the hosting, whatever. So that's what you have to understand, is that if you go into it with the mentality of you're going to pay someone to think for you, to make decisions for you, first of all, the costs go way up and the risks go way up, right? Oftentimes when we were giving that, seemingly inflated quote for building the website for someone, a lot of that was going to be like us talking to them and sussing out what they actually needed from a website, and us kind of being the technical end of that and being like, okay, because you need this and you might need this in the future, you need this technology stack, which is more complicated than it would have been, but now you won't have to rebuild the website in the future. And that's a consideration that someone who wasn't familiar with the technology wouldn't know. And I think poker kind of works in a similar way, right? It's, if you're looking at, say, GTO ranges and saying, okay, well, I'm just going to copy the GTO ranges, the thing you have to remember is that like the GTO ranges also assume you can play perfect post flop and kind of make plays that are in a GTO orientation. If that's not true, there's a lot of value in potentially much tighter ranges than GTO ranges. And that's something that we've built into Redshift core, is that we pick ranges that are a lot tighter than GTO ranges for the absolute beginners that we want to give ranges to, because I think it's just the logical way to approach that problem. But as a beginner, you actually might disagree with that. You're like, well, you know what? I'm not that worried about losing money at the small stakes. And therefore, I'm willing to take on more risk, and I'm going to play more hands. I'm going to play closer to GTO, or maybe even wider than GTO, right? Because I don't care. Like, if I lose money, that's fine. I want to maximize my learning. And so, if you look at like what is the credibility of the ranges that we created for core, well, they just don't apply to your goals in that scenario, right? Because we're trying to create ranges that are going to be useful for the average beginner, who are going to protect themselves, who aren't going to feel bad if they we're trying to minimize the amount that a beginner might lose, while also creating the foundations of like a good winning strategy, and talking about like, hey, well, there are these wider GTO ranges coming, and actually that's built into the ranges. We kind of show like what are the wider, more aggressive ranges that include more discretion and include more skill playing post flop that you might start thinking about, and that's all built in, and you kind of see that up front. And I think that's kind of what's really important. And when you're looking for this, credible sources of information, is you have to make sure that the assumptions and goals that you have match up with the source of information. And so really, someone who has gone through exactly what you've gone through is generally going to be the most credible source of information, right? If you're just learning to play, 2 no limit online or 10 no limit online, and you just want to get a feel for how things are going, you don't need to memorize GTO ranges. That's just not necessary. Like, if you make a mistake in a 4-bet range pot, right, with ace queen, like you make the wrong, you like fold it instead of calling it, or you don't bluff it as a 5-bet bluff on occasion, or something like that. How big of a deal is that at 10 no limit? First of all, it's just, hopefully not that much money relative to what you can gamble. And secondly, it's an infrequent scenario, and you're probably, if you're using a basic strategy, not going to be either too far behind or too, giving up too much by not memorizing all that. And really, you just need to start getting experience at the table, feeling what gambling is like, getting experience with like implementing a strategy in general, right? Like, that's just what's happening in that scenario. Versus, someone who's really dedicated and maybe a serious hobbyist, or considering trying to go professional, and they want to beat like 1-2 online and, make $20 to $50 an hour or whatever. That person needs a very different approach. It's just, the reality of the situation. And if you try and take sources of information from the same place, you may be able to glean some interesting things looking at anything. I think as poker players always tend to just take a peek at what everyone else is doing and see what's going on when someone comes up with a new product, etc. There's always a lot of interest in just seeing like, well, is there something we can learn from this approach and all that? But at the end of the day, you really ideally want someone who is kind of optimized around the goals that are very similar to you. And if that's not available to you, right, if there isn't someone who's directly doing what you want to do, then you have to start kind of unbundling the assumptions that are built into that course, built into that strategy, etc., and seeing if you can pull out the individual pieces. So, again, going into one of the strategies actually I've used with students in the past, I think I talked about this recently on the podcast, is when I start, with a student or something like that, I'm really going to give them kind of a tight range to start, right? Just tight range, see if you can execute it consistently, so you have the discipline to follow a strategy. If anything goes wrong before that, then it's just like, we have other work to do rather than work on the strategy. We just have to make sure we know how to implement something and why we're implementing it, et cetera. Get on board with the consistency aspect that'll be needed to be a successful winning player. So if that's not in place, we deal with that. If it is in place, we start with a basic strategy. Once the basic strategy is in place, one of my favorite things to do is just open people up on the button. And the reason I like to do this is that it's the easiest position to play, right? So number one, as we start to add hands that maybe are more affected by your post-flop skill, we're putting you in a situation where you will have the easiest time demonstrating that skill on the button, right? So it's easier to just put in a flop C bet in position. You kind of create the bet sizing meta off the back of that. And you don't have to respond as much to bet sizing choices by your opponent. Like, you know, they can check raise you, but like it's just not as common as, you know, facing various bet sizes as a C bet out of position, right? So that's a really nice, clean way where you can start to get experience with a very individualized portion. You might pull out a small piece of it. You might say, okay, like I'm really uncomfortable, or I'm really comfortable with, like, say, open raises, but I'm really uncomfortable with 3-betting light. And I want to start integrating that. So how do I go about that? And so you can kind of go look at the different approaches that people have for 3-betting light, the different ranges they use, and figure out what makes the most sense. You know, it may not make the most sense to say, take a perfect mixed strategy of like calling and 3-betting to start, where you're going to have to remember, okay, I'm going to call nines 50% of the time, 3-bet it 50% of the time. That might just be too complicated for someone who's just trying to get a feel for 3-betting. You might just say, take a 3-bet or fold strategy, which is something that, you know, we've recommended a lot. It's just like, hey, for the most part, like you're not giving up very much if you just 3-bet or fold. Start with that. And then all of a sudden you're playing a lot more 3-bet pots, but you're playing with a very tight range and you're very protected in those pots. And you get a sense of like, oh, like where am I struggling with? Maybe there's issues with my bet sizing out of position. That's putting me in really challenging spots. That's a very common one. And yeah, it's an easy way to kind of step in and work with one assumption within a strategy without necessarily having to use the entire strategy or completely unbundle it. So I know it's pretty complicated, but, you know, at the end of the day, I think the thing to remember is that, like, I don't think you should really trust anyone just full on. Like, just don't assume that they will take the assumptions and your place in the game at heart. You know, everyone who's creating poker strategy, I'm sure, is to some degree trying to address a market of people who are doing things, and that may or may not apply as well to you, or not, you know, the level of applicability will vary. So yeah, I just think, remember that, understand that, like, just because someone's saying something doesn't mean you have to assume it's true. And I think that's a good lesson in life in general, but it applies very directly to poker, where at the end of the day, you know, poker is an evolving solution, right? We're definitely not at the point where the game is solved. Certain areas of the game are quote unquote solved. But a really interesting analogy I think we talked about a while back is that the solutions in real world terms tend to be better when a human works with a computer, right? So if you're able to sort of integrate the knowledge that comes with GTO solutions and solvers and things like that, but then, you know, and this is actually an example, we've done this a couple of times on the Poker Bank recently, where we basically, I go ahead and I run runs, GTO solver runs for a hand, and I do it in multiple ways. So like, let's say we did a Dwan analysis in the high stakes poker recently, and we had him betting large on the flop, and we kind of showed that, like, for the most part, even though it was a multi-way pot, which isn't great for solvers, you know, betting large on the flop was a very weak play from a GTO perspective, right? And that, you know, the GTO or the solver would tend to have you check a lot. But that was only if the assumption of that the solver is making is if we are able to check or bet large. We weren't giving it the option to bet small. And so if you were to say, then run the solver again and give it the option to bet large or small or check, you're going to get a totally different solution. And we will be able to glean information in between those two solves to say, oh, like, these are the types of hands that would prefer to bet large. These are the types of hands that would prefer to bet small. And then we can start to use our human intuition to say, well, based on the tendencies of the people in this situation, this is what I think is now optimal. And we're going way beyond, like, what is, like, the optimal solution at that point. We are interpreting the solutions based on our real world scenario. And for me, that is the cutting edge of poker right now, is like, can I get a sense of what multiple comparisons, changing one or two variables, teach me about that situation? Are there hands that are better optimized with a larger bet size? Are there hands that are better optimized with tighter ranges from our opponents, etc.? Like, you can play around with so many variables in these situations, and there is no solution, right? It's really much, it's driven by your assessment of the situation, your understanding of the capabilities of your opponents and their tendencies. But you have a nice basis in terms of like, well, given these variables, we can compare the solutions that we know are 100% locked in and correct based on our assumptions. So I know they got pretty deep, but I think it's fascinating. If you have any questions about like, or challenges or experiences where you've trusted someone and you feel like it really didn't work out, I'm really interested in that. Just let us know, like, what do you think about trusting sources of information in poker, and what have been the challenges that you've run into? So that's it for now. I'll log off, and check us out on the Poker Bank, and I'm at CWar on Twitter. So bye, everyone. What is up, everyone? I wanted to cut in real quick and just talk really quickly about what do you do when you're ready to start taking your poker game more seriously. And for me, the starting place with almost everyone is to really start thinking about, a pre-flop range chart, pre-flop decision making. Let's get a basic strategy in place. And one of the things we have for you right now that you can go and check out totally free, go to redchippoker.com/bulletproof. That's /bulletproof, and that's all one word. Go check that out, and you can get a free set of opening ranges of exactly what we would recommend for a beginner to play. You have sort of the discretion demonstrated of like, here's your really tight bulletproof range. And then here are hands that like a lot of people do include in various situations and you'll want to think about. So we have those full free opening ranges ready for you. Just go over there, you give your email. It's real easy. After that, we have the full set of ranges, 3-bet ranges, 4-bet ranges, all that type of thing in core. Go to redchippoker.com/core. And if you're ready for the GTO ranges, these are the most advanced ranges, but they're also the most protected, backed by simulations, etc. We have those in pro, and you just go to redchippoker.com/membership. So if you're interested in getting started, get your pre-flop ranges in order, go check those out. Number 1, redchippoker.com/bulletproof. Number 2, redchippoker.com/core. And number 3, redchippoker.com/membership.